So here we are once again in Microsoft Flight Simulator to look at another unknown aeroplane. For the simulator, this one came out today. I will put a link in the description below to where you can get hold of this thing. It's available from Sim Market. And this is the BR Sim Designs Beechcraft Debonair 35E33. Which if you're not familiar with that aeroplane, basically it was a budget version of the Beechcraft Bonanza. More about that when we talk a little bit about the history of the aeroplane. But first, let's talk about the add-on itself. So, as I say, I will put a link in the description below to where you can get this thing from. It costs €28, which converts to about 24 quid in pounds sterling, which is what I paid for it. And for that, you get a Beechcraft Debonair simulation, and you get about 8 paint jobs with the thing. Some of which are more modern, some of which are a bit old school. This you can see that I've got one of the old school ones here. That was one of the things that was budget about the Debonair when it first came out. They didn't paint it; they just put sort of stripes on it, but it kind of looks sort of cool with bare metal finish. So I kind of like that. You know what I mean? I'd regard that as a plus point rather than a minus point, apart from the weatherproofing. Now, as you can see, this is a pretty nice model of I say Debonair, but it's a Bonanza, basically. It was a chopped down budget version of a Bonanza. And you can see that it is a pretty nice model, and it stands up to pretty close inspection as well. We'll have a look at that in a little bit of detail, so you can see there's some close-up detail of the thing. You can see the air intakes and the prop, and the undercarriage is nicely textured. You can see good detail on the landing light on the nose gear and what have you. So pretty nice, really. And overall, it looks pretty good. And we've got some exterior whistles and bells on here as well, which you can select if you want to. So we've got chocks, and we've got engine covers, and there's a pitot tube cover, and we've got the baggage compartment open. So it's a nice model, and it's got some whistles and bells on it. However, there is an issue with this model, and if you have a keen eye, you might already have spotted it, and that is that it is somewhat larger, i.e. oversized compared to the real size of a Bonanza or Debonair. Now, for the benefit of you to be able to check this out, what I've done is I've parked it against alongside an AI aeroplane, and we can see that this is sort of like a little bit oversized. Now, I reckon this thing is probably about 25% too large. The thing that gives it away is the size of the pilot in the cockpit, who looks a little bit lost in there. And I think, it's about 25% bigger than it should be. Now, that doesn't really matter too much when you view the thing in isolation, and it's not so large that it doesn't fit on runways or taxiways and stuff like that. But when you see it alongside of the stuff, it is a little bit oversized. Now, hopefully they'll patch that. But it's not the only aeroplane that the Microsoft Flight Simulator does that. I believe the Milviz Corsair is a little bit oversized as well. And if you've seen my review of that, you'll know that that didn't really put me off the thing at all. So yeah, they might scale it down a little bit. Hopefully they will do. But it's not the end of the world as far as I'm concerned, because I do think it's really nicely textured, and it is an accurate model of the thing. So that's the exterior of it. More on the inside, it's very nice as well. You can see there the height of the wing compared to the aircraft alongside it. It's a little bit oversized. But on the inside, it is very nice and very, very beautifully textured. You can see there nice texturing on the seats, and they've got the sort of cargo area at the back, and very nice detail on the instruments and what have you. So that all looks really, really good and beautifully modelled and what have you. So it looks really, really nice. Now, one of the things that you do get on this is you get this little switch here, so we can shut the baggage door and we can remove the static elements. Now, you'll notice that there is an option there for winglets on the little tip tanks on this thing, so we can put those on. They don't really affect how it flies, and they don't really affect the fuel economy that much, but as they probably wouldn't on the real thing. But you can have them for the style of it if you want to. And the other option that you can have on here is there is a little option there for a different attitude indicator. So we can have a traditional attitude indicator, or we can click that on and you get a sort of PFD style attitude indicator, which I will show you when we've got the thing powered up. So let's get to that. Anyway, let's have a bit of a tour of the cockpit. So up top, not really a lot going on up there, as there isn't in the real aeroplane. You've got some sunshades that you can move about if you want to. You don't have to, but they do actually operate. You've got a little DV window there, a little vent window. That, if you are in flight and you have damage enabled, will crash the plane. So be careful about that, unless you turn off your damage. It's not the only add-on aeroplane that does that, but just be aware of it. The door opens like that, so very nice, and you'll notice that things get louder when the door does open, so that's good. Anyway, let's have a bit of a tour of the cockpit. So we've already seen this thing here, where we can turn the static elements off and add a few whistles and bells. And then down here, what we've got is we've got a fuel selector. And if we zoom in on that thing, don't let this thing catch you out. It will start when you load this thing with the fuel selector off. So you know, if you don't notice that, you'll be wondering why the thing doesn't start on. You'll notice that we can select the left and right tanks. So you manually have to switch that, otherwise you'll get a fuel imbalance. So at the moment, you can see that what I've got is fairly balanced fuel, and you'll notice we've got left tip tank, right tip tank there. And so what I actually have is I have fuel transfer pumps there where I can move stuff around if I want to. But yeah, don't let that one catch you out. Now, there is a control column on here. Now, because this was, the Debonair was basically a budget bonanza that they stripped things out of, it does not have two control columns. And you'll notice it doesn't have rudder pedals on the other side. So you're flying this from the left side. And not from the right. It has got an operable trim switch on there and a little pitch trim button on there. But you can get that thing out of the way if you want to. So yeah, don't be fooled by that. It looks like one of those control columns that you could sort of like swing over to the other side and what have you. But it isn't. Doesn't function like that in the sim. So other stuff. So we've got magneto switches there, which we'll be using in a moment. We've got the alternator switch and the battery switch on there. So I will turn the battery on and I will turn the alternator on so we start getting things powering up. And if we put the fuel transfer pumps on, you can hear that we get sound for that. I won't put those on because it'll be a little bit annoying. We've got a firewall there that we can open there. Circuit breakers, they all work. So we can turn off the avionics, turn off the pitot heat and all this lot, and all the way across these things work. All of those circuit breakers there. So if you want realistic circuit breakers in your plane, then this thing does actually have them. It also has a working ELT, emergency location transmitter, which you will hear now. Like that. I don't think anything's really going to come and rescue you if you crash in the middle of the wilderness, but you know, as opposed to a lot of add-ons where you flick that switch and it doesn't really do much, it actually does make a siren noise in this sim. So we've got your standard navigation stuff there, standard navigation gauges down there. We've got fuel gauges for the tip tanks and the main tanks there. You've got cowl flaps there, which we can open if we want to. You've got the elevator tabs there with a little indicator on it so you can see your indication. You will need a little bit of nose trim to get this thing in the air. We've got a flap lever there, which will work. You've got pitch trim there. Moving across, we've got these dials here, which you can see are the avionics brightness and the floodlight brightness. We've got an auxiliary fuel pump there that we can turn on if we want to, like that. We've got throttle, prop, and mixture there. We've got a landing gear lever there. We've got taxi lights, landing lights. We'll move the view over. So we've got beacon lights, nav lights, strobe lights, and the pitot heat there. When I get this thing up and running, we'll have a look at the lights on the exterior. So all of this sort of switches for the lights and circuit breakers, all of that stuff works. All right, coming back across here, you've got a fairly standard 6-pack. However, you can change that to be a more modern PFD, a little bit like an airliner style PFD, if you want to, or you can keep it traditional like that. So we've got your regulation 6-pack stuff there. We've got temperature gauge there. You've got engine gauges there, RPM indicators and what have you, oil temperature, cylinder head temperature, amps, oil pressure, blah, 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 exhaust gas temperature, and what have you. Indicators for the landing gear and the flaps. And then we've got a fairly standard radio on there. You can do GPS navigation, or you can do standard sort of navigation on there. A slight replication of instruments over there, like you've got an altimeter and what have you. And you've got a vacuum gauge there with inches of mercury, and that is about the size of it. I mean, obviously we can turn on the transponder if we want, and we've got sort of traditional ADF stuff on there if you want to do old school navigation. There is an autopilot there. If you have a hardware autopilot such as the Logitech Satec hardware autopilot, that does work perfectly fine with this thing. And another thing worth noting with this is that when you buy it and download it, it installs into the community folder, which means that you can see the aircraft config file. So you could get to the thing and modify it if you wanted to. This thing works as well. You know, it's slightly annoying from this viewpoint here, is that you can open this compartment. Now that's kind of interesting that you've got that thing there, but you can't get to the switch to close it because it starts reading that you want to close the door. So to close it, you have to move your view across so that you can actually get your cursor on there. So that's a little bit annoying that it does that, but it's not really a fault of the actual add-on. It's that's the sim for you. So I'll get that thing back, and we'll get the yoke in the middle, and that's about the size of it in terms of what you've got in there. So it is a pretty basic Beechcraft Bonanza, an old school one, with a few nods to modern navigation, i.e. a modern radio set with a GPS installed on there, and the option to have a little sort of pseudo primary flight display on there. So let's get this thing cranked up. So we'll just make sure that we've got everything. So I want the mixture on rich. I'm going to get the prop forward on there. I'm just going to sort of make sure that the throttle's working okay. I am using a Satec hardware throttle to move all that stuff, but obviously what you can do is you can move those levers with other controls that you've got. So we've got the battery, the alternator on. There is an auxiliary fuel pump switch there, which I'm going to turn on to help the thing start, and then away we go with the magnetos, and hopefully it should start. And there it goes, cranking up. Now you can start this with Control E if you want to. So if it's all cold and dark and what have you, you can hit Control E and it will start. So if you don't want to be clicking all those switches and making sure everything's in the right position, then Control E will actually work. Another thing, what I am going to do here is I'm going to turn that pump off so that we've not got that going on there, and then what we'll do is we'll have a look on the outside with the engine running. But before we do that, notice that the prop animation, I think that's a little bit obtrusive against the clouds. It's not terrible, but I've seen better, let's put it that way. So that could do with a little bit of a tweak. That and the fact that this is a little bit oversized, although not desperately bad, are probably the only two bad points I would say about it, and neither one of them is really a showstopper, to be honest. Now here we go on the external view. You'll notice it's got a little bit of an issue with the pilot sort of lagging to appear, but considering that the pilot appears a little bit small in there because the aircraft is oversized, that is not the end of the world. So there's the propeller. Now, as I say, you know, I don't think it's the best animation I've ever seen of a propeller, but I can live with it. Although what I tend to think is that if you look at the spinner, the animation of the spinner, to me, it looks like the spinner's loose. It looks like it's a bit off kilter. And if I was looking at a real aeroplane and saw the spinner doing that, I'd be running and taking cover because it looks like it's about to fly off, you know. So I think they could do with sorting out the prop animation a little bit. Obviously, you know, you don't see that spinner looking a bit wacky from the cockpit view. But, you know, it's one of those things to be aware of. Now, if there was anything else that I could be picky about with this, I'll show you what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it nighttime on there. And you can see night lighting's pretty good. You know, nav lights are okay, nice and bright and what have you. The landing lights and the taxi light and all that kind of stuff works and what have you. But there is some bleed on the inside from this anti-collision beacon on top. I'll show you what I mean. We'll go in the cockpit and we got a little bit of that going on. Now, I suppose you could say that that was light bouncing around, but to me it looks a little bit like it's sort of bleeding through and what have you. But, you know, take it or leave it. I think that could do with toning down a little bit, but it's difficult to know how you can do it without affecting how that is. What I do like here very much is the interior cockpit lighting. I think that's really, really nice, that. And obviously what we can do is we can dim things down a little bit if you want to. So you want a nice sort of intimate night flying look on there, you can have that. And then what we've got is the flood lighting can get toned down a little bit as well. Now, the other thing that we need to look at is obviously you've got that, where you can have a more sort of airliner style PFD on there if you want to. So yeah, I think the night lighting is very good. And to be honest, that where it's sort of like lighting up the back, you have to sort of spin your head round to see that anyway, you know what I mean? So yeah, I certainly don't think it's the end of the world. So I'll get the yoke back there again, and we'll take it for a little bit of a fly. So yeah, the sounds on this, by the way, are, as far as I'm aware, they are the default Asobo Microsoft Flight Simulator Beechcraft G36. Now, strictly speaking, this variant of the Beechcraft Debonair, the 35E33, had 225 horsepower, 470k Continental 6-cylinder engine, whereas the G36 has a slightly later variant of that engine. But they are both 6-cylinder horizontally opposed flat sixes, and they do sound very, very similar. And there are one or two G36s and Debonairs that actually share the same engine variant on them. So I don't mind too much that they've used that. You know, I think purists would go, oh, you know, it's not exactly the same, but for me, it's close enough. So I'm reasonably happy with that. Now, obviously, since we are going for a bit of a takeoff, what I'm going to do, release the parking brakes, and away we go. You want to see this taxiing from the outside? There you go. So yeah, it's pretty stable on the ground there. Look at that, taxiing without even looking where I'm going. And hopefully that's reasonably well lined up, since I wasn't. Oh, look at that. It's almost like I planned it, isn't it? Right, so now, obviously, what you need to do is you need to trim up a little bit for this. Now, you can see we have got animated trim tabs on the tail of this thing because you will need a bit of upwards trim to take this thing off the deck. So there we are in the cockpit now. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hide the yoke for the takeoff so that you can see the rudder pedals, because you don't need a vast amount of rudder on this thing to get it off the deck. So if you're one of those people who are like, oh yeah, what's it, real aeroplanes, you need to sort of be kicking in a bit of rudder and stuff like that. You know, if that's the sort of thing that, you know, like bothers you and what have you, have a look, because you don't need a lot of rudder to keep this thing going straight down the runway. So let's just make sure that we're all right. Mixture's fully forward, props fully forward. And we're all okay. We're not going to worry about ATC, so let's power this baby up and get it in the air. Now, there's no rudder input at all, and you'll see that it is pulling to the left a little bit, I have to give it a little bit, but I'm not actually having to give it a massive amount of rudder to keep it tracking straight down the runway. So, you know, you need to give it a little bit of right rudder, but not a great deal. And then we can get this thing into the air. And then obviously what we need to do is, once we know we've got a positive rate of climb and we haven't got any runway left in front of us, we'll get the gear up like that, and then we'll make sure everything else is clean, you know, no flaps still down on the thing or what have you. Now you'll notice there it's pitching down a little bit, so I would need to give it a fair bit of trim to get it flying level. Right, so let's come back on the throttle and the prop a little bit and bring this thing around. So here we go. Now you can see this thing, it looks nice in the air. Like I say, I'm not the world's biggest fan of that prop animation, and the pilot's a bit on the small side because of that oversized issue, but you know, it looks pretty good in the air, and that is also true at night. Looks pretty nice. So pretty cool, yeah. Generally speaking, I think this thing flies pretty well. It's getting decent frame rates. I've got photogrammetry on, and I'm over Manchester city centre. This is add-on photo scenery, flightsim.to, and you can see that this thing's not having any problems staying smooth. It's sort of fluctuating between about 29 and 25 frames per second, which is, you know, okay, it's certainly acceptable. You can see the thing is smooth. Now, roll rate wise, you got that, which I think is about more or less on the money for what a Bonanza, or in this case Debonair, would do. Speed wise, it's alright. The autopilot works okay on it. All the avionics seem to work okay. It is pretty much on the numbers on the way that it performs. What I did to sort of test this thing out was I took off from Barton, where we took off, which is Manchester, UK, and I flew this thing all the way to France and had it on the autopilot up at about 15,000 feet, and it behaved perfectly. So, you know, you're not going to find this thing crashing after 10 minutes in the sim or what have you. You know what I mean? Although, as I say, don't open that DV window if you've got damage on, because that will crash things. So we're bringing that thing round, and we'll fly back over the airfield, and then we'll bring it in for a landing. So let's talk a little bit about the real thing, shall we? So you probably know about the Beechcraft Bonanza. The Beechcraft Bonanza was a fairly revolutionary aircraft when it came out, because the Beechcraft Bonanza first flew in 1945, right at the end of 1945, in December 1945, the Beechcraft Bonanza made its debut flight, and then it went into production. And I think you could order it in 1946, and it started getting delivered in 1947. So it's right at the end of the Second World War that the Beechcraft Bonanza started showing up. And you know, when you consider that all the other airplanes that were about, with a few exceptions like, you know, the Globe Swift and things like that, most airplanes at the time were things like, you know, Piper Cubs and Osters and stuff like that. So it was a hugely revolutionary airplane. But it wasn't long until it had a rival. The Beechcraft Bonanza's main rival, production-wise, was probably the Piper Comanche. Maybe the Cessna Centurion, but probably the Piper Comanche is the main rival of the Beechcraft Bonanza. But of course, the Piper Comanche isn't produced anymore. But at the time, the Comanche was a lot cheaper than the Bonanza, and so that was hurting Beechcraft sales of the Bonanza. So what they did was they decided to do a cheaper version of the Beechcraft Bonanza, and that's what the Debonair was. They put a cheaper interior in the thing, much simpler avionics, less trim on the thing, very basic paint and stuff like that. However, what a lot of people did was all of the options that you could get for the Debonair could basically take it up to the same level as a Beechcraft Bonanza. So you don't really find that many Debonairs that don't really look like a Beechcraft Bonanza in most respects. And in the end, they kind of realised that it was like, yeah, it's really just a cheaper Beechcraft Bonanza. So they started producing the Debonair in 1959 to combat rival aircraft such as that Piper, the Comanche. And they kept producing the Debonair for about 10 years, till 1969, and eventually they kind of came out and admitted it was like, well, let's just call it what it is, which is a Bonanza with less fancy trim in it. Yeah, so that's what that is. Now, one of the things you will know about the Beechcraft Bonanza, or at least almost certainly will know, is that it's got a really rather bad nickname, which is the Doctor Killer. And the reason for that is that, it was quite an expensive luxury aeroplane compared to other sort of GA aeroplanes. And so what it tended to be was an aeroplane that sort of fairly well-to-do doctors would buy. And very often that would be pilots that had a few hours, but not a massive amount of hours, and then they'd fly a plane that was like reasonably well equipped for kind of IFR, but they'd be kind of VFR pilots, and they'd fly into instrument meteorological conditions, get spatially disorientated, and then the thing would go out of control. And the other thing with the Beechcraft Bonanza, the early versions, and the Debonair was that it was a bit sensitive to trim. You could fairly easily put it out of trim, and then what that would do is that would make it go out of control if you weren't careful, if you flew into cloud and stuff like that. And then what would happen is it would get flutter on the tail, and the tail would rip off, and next minute you'd be coming out of a cloud with your tail missing, upside down, spinning towards the ground with nothing that you could do about it. And that's why it got the name of the Doctor Killer. Not entirely deserved, to be fair, but that was kind of the reputation that it had. Now, on the subject of that and what Beechcraft did about it, they obviously tweaked things a little bit and what have you. But I'm sure you will know that there is a Bonanza, a default Bonanza in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is the G36, and you might be looking at this thing and thinking, well, hang on, I've got a Bonanza already in the sim that I don't have to pay for at all because I've already bought the sim. Why would I want to buy a Debonair, which was the cheaper version of the Bonanza? It's like, why would you want to pay more money to get a sort of less sophisticated version of the same aeroplane? And the answer is that it's not the same aeroplane. Yes, the Debonair was a cheaper version of the Bonanza, and yes, there is a Bonanza that is a default aeroplane in your sim, but they're not the same Bonanza. The Bonanza that's in the sim is a G36 Bonanza. Now, what you need to be aware of with that for the history of Bonanzas is that the V-tail Bonanza, which was the original version that was expensive, which led to them producing the traditional tailed version, which was the Debonair. The V-tail Bonanza stopped production in 1982, and the conventional tailed Bonanza, like this one, stopped production in 1995. But what Beechcraft did was they designed the G36 Bonanza, which is the one that you get in the sim by default, and it's not the same as this thing. Looks very similar, but it's not the same. And one of the things that it sorts out was that Doctor Killer reputation was partially because it was pretty trim sensitive. So the G36 Bonanza actually has a slightly longer fuselage to give it a little bit more stability in the center of gravity and stuff like that. So even though, you know, they're both Bonanzas and the Debonair is essentially a Bonanza, they're not the same aeroplane. And, you know, the other thing about the G36 that's a default aeroplane in the sim is it's got a glass PFD cockpit, whereas this thing's got traditional gauges. So if you want a bit more of an old school cockpit and a bit more of a traditional look and what have you, but with the benefit of some GPS avionics in there, I mean, it's not totally old school, then this is what this thing offers. So, you know, this is the Bonanza that killed a lot of people, whereas the G36 Bonanza, that's the default one in your sim, is not really that. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the Debonair, which is a cheaper version of the original Bonanza, is the one that killed lots of famous people, including Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, the Big Bopper, Jim Reeves, Steve Wozniak was nearly killed in one. You know, the Apple co-founder, he was piloting one and crashed it, and he was quite badly injured, but he made a full recovery. Randy Rhoads, who was Ozzy Osbourne's guitarist, he was killed in one. So yeah, you'll note that none of those were doctors, but it still gets the reputation of being the doctor killer. But you know, the fact that it's sort of like a few famous people have died in Beechcraft Bonanzas is where it kind of gets that the rich person's toy killer, the doctor killer name for it. So, you know, if you want something that can be a little bit challenging to fly in that it's sensitive in the CG and has old school avionics as opposed to the G36, just a bit more pilot friendly and is your default aeroplane, then that's kind of the reason to get one of these things. So there we are, and we're lining up for the circuit, so I'll bring this thing in for a landing. So yeah, this thing's a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more tricky to fly than the G36. A little bit more twitch sensitive, but you can see I'm not having any problems. I mean, I'm cheerfully sort of like chatting to you and talking about all this stuff while I'm flying it around. So, you know, it's not like it's a handful. I'm not having to fight the thing or anything like that. So anyway, let's get the gear down. Let's chuck some flaps down. Let's get a bit of power on. So we get the prop fully forward. And there we are. We're sort of configured for landing, which might make it a little bit sensitive. And then we'll come back on the throttle and we'll go in the cockpit again and we'll bring this thing round. Don't want to get too slow on the turn. We're in good shape for the airfield. Oh, and another thing about this is it side slips really well. So if things are getting a bit high, you can lose altitude with the thing pretty easily. So yeah, it's got a nice fly model. There we go. So it didn't kill me, but then again, I'm not a doctor. Right. So see the thing in, right? Oh. Suppose I should look where I'm going, really, shouldn't I? So yeah, do I think this is worth having? Well, despite the fact that it's got that scaling issue, and you can see the propeller against the clouds. It's not the best, but I don't mind it that much. I think that the positive aspects of it outweigh those issues, and I suspect that they will probably be patched. So the entire model needs scaling down a little bit, but hopefully that wouldn't be too tricky to do. And the propeller animation, I don't like the way the spinner's sort of wobbling all over the place. I can live with the bit that appears against the sky. I'm not too bothered about that. So I think that this is pretty nice, yeah. And for the money, I think it's pretty good, you know what I mean? Because it's sort of about kind of the same money that Carinado add-on aeroplanes are and things like that. And as you can see, it is very nice in terms of the VC. Very, very nice texturing indeed. That stands up to very, very close inspection. I mean, yeah, if you want to get really picky, you can see, like the polygons on that curve when you get really, really close to it. But I think generally speaking, the texturing on it is really, really nice. And I think the avionics fit on it's nice. And I think features-wise, it's nice with all of the circuit breakers working and everything else and all that kind of stuff. And the little options on there and the nice option to change to a primary flight display. And so I think it's got a lot of benefits. If you like an old school Bonanza, I know it's not a Bonanza, it's a Debonair, but eventually they did start calling it the Bonanza. And you've got 24 quid, i.e. 28 euros or whatever that would be in dollars. Bearing in mind that the pound sterling has tanked massively. So the exchange rate's all over the place. Thank you for taking us out of the EU and causing that. We'll get political there. If you want an old school Bonanza in your sim, then I think that's pretty good. Just be aware that it's probably going to need a patch to make it stop being so big, and it could do with a little bit of a tweak to the prop animation. Can you see what I mean about the spinner looking like it looks about to fall off or what have you? If they sorted those two things out, I think it'd be great. Because I love the look of it. That sort of like bare metal look, I think is fantastic. And there are some painted versions of it and all that kind of stuff. Link in the description of where you can get this thing, as I say, from Sim Market. And just to sort of round things off, you get 8 paint jobs with it. I think it's 8, round about that. You get 2 PDF manuals with it. One of them is, I think, 14 pages, if I remember rightly. And that's sort of like a guide to the aeroplane and what have you, and all the, installing it and all that kind of stuff, and all the labeling of what things are in the cockpit. And then the other PDF is a single-page PDF which has a bunch of checklists on it. And as I say, you can find that documentation in the community folder where this thing installs, and because it goes in the community folder, people will be able to tweak it. They'll be able to get to the aircraft config files and paint it and all that kind of stuff. So there you go. And I would think that there are probably going to be a lot of repaints for this thing because, they made the Debonair for nearly 10 years. They didn't make that many of them. I think total production was about less than 300, but there are still a lot of them about, and so there are a lot of different paint jobs on the thing, and it is essentially a Bonanza, so Bonanza paint jobs are going to look good on it as well. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Chocks Anger. Quick shots. I've got another one coming up, possibly tomorrow if my throat holds up. But that's the last day before I go back to work. But hopefully I'm going to get that done tomorrow. I've done all the sort of pre-stuff for it and what have you. Fingers crossed I'll get that one out. But anyway, check this one out, and that's it. Don't forget to put your comments and all that lot, and subscribe, or tell me I don't know what I'm talking about or whatever, because I always like to hear from you. Anyway, let's shut this thing down. So, good shutdown noise as well. Anyway, that's it for now. Bye.